morning sun flying high in the sky till the day is done. I can't break away. Like a child in his fantasy, punching holes in the walls of reality. All my life I wanted to fly, but I don't have the wings, and I wonder why I can't break away. Oh, well, Mama told me when I was young, stand tall, girl, you're number one. But you can be what you wanna be, but you can't change the course of your destiny. I can't break away. Well, no, I can't break away. Well, I can't break away. Well, no, I can't break away. Ooh, I can't break away.
Greetings, my excellent friend.
Greetings indeed. Welcome in, as we are coming back from the break. Hope you all had a good holiday weekend. I've talked to most of you. Diggity, thank you for the resub, as well as Rocket and Doc. Doc at Tier 3, continued amazing support every month. Thank you very much. So welcome back from the break. We all took the 4th of July holiday weekend off, technically, even though...
My lord, go f*** yourself!
Last weekend raised a ton of money for Extra Life via Sturf and the Omega. I know that went over, I think, $1,300 was a astronomical sum. Hey, that should be off. Why are those still playing? That should... Oh, I know why that's on. There's a specific reason why that's on tonight. We're just going to have to deal with it, because Permanoob told me that he'll be along shortly. And some of you know what that's about. So, we are going to get the normal stuff out of the way. I'm not a historian. I am a student of history. If you want to check me on my sources, come on hang out in the channel during a live stream and hit !sources. And you'll be linked to a Google Doc that you can go read all the things I've read in order to come on here and talk about France. Corrections, we don't have any from last week. Been doing really good about being accurate for a couple weeks now. I think the last mistake I made was the number of troops at the Bastille. So where we left things off last week was this reshuffling that was occurring kinda within the National Assembly after the chaotic events of the summer, and we got into the Great Fear and how it really the Breton Club moved forward with an agenda in order to kind of leverage that violence, and it ended up pretty much dismantling feudalism across France entirely. The Declaration of August 11th, summarizing all of those points, and we kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about here tonight, which is what happens whenever France, especially the National Assembly, whose tennis court oath stated purpose, remember, is to come up with a new constitution for France. What happens when they try to do that? Because it's not as easy to write something like that as you would think. So the key thing to understand here is that writing a constitution is not going to take, a month and a half or 2 months. This is just the beginning phases of it, but there will be events that occur while they're writing the Constitution that are going to dramatically impact how that document is written. And the factions that we elaborated on last week, the Monarchians and the Breton Club, who are about to become something a little bit more sinister than that, how they were basically representing a centrist conservative versus a more radical, get everything we can out of it kind of position. So the topics for tonight, you'll see at the bottom of the screen here. The rights of man, which is why the Marquis de Lafayette is given prime top billing today. He probably won't be the last time he's up there, but he is going to drive what is known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which will actually serve as the preamble to the Constitution that France, the National Assembly, attempts to write in 1789. And then we'll get into, well, if it's called the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen, what does that mean? What does citizen mean? And it's not what you would think. It's not everyone who lives in France. believe it or not. And then we'll get into some of the details about where the true conflicts were in the Constitution writing process, the primary one being the royal veto. And then we're going to get to the three gentlemen in the middle, Adrien Duport, Antoine Barnave, and Alexandre de la Mette, who will form what is known in history as the triumvirate, which is actually a take on the triumvirates of Roman times, the first triumvirate being Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar. That idea of a triangle power share manifests itself as we roll out of the summer of 1789 in France in these three gentlemen. You also notice that Thomas Jefferson's on there. He's not been president yet, but he'll serve a little bit of an important role for about a day during all of these deliberations. So let's get into it. It has been assumed since before the Estates General that, by everybody, remember we talked way back about the Dauphine delegation when they were establishing their Estates Provincial, that one of their key things, especially one of the key things that was coming out of Mounier, was that they wanted to get a new constitution written as a part of the Estates General. And then Duport as well, Adrien Duport, when he was in the Paris Parliament, was talking about how he was allying himself with the Prémunil, even though they were political just contradictions, but they had a similar goal. They wanted the Estates General called. One, because de Prémunil wanted to kind of undercut the king's authority, and Duport because he shared that same notion as Mounier. He wanted to use the Estates General as this vehicle that would allow France to get a written constitution. So Duport and Mounier and many, many others like them had this notion rolling into the Estates General that one of its jobs was to get this constitution written, despite the fact that the reason it was called in the first place was to solve a financial crisis, which they haven't solved yet. It's now August. We've been rolling with the Estates/Assembly since May, and the financial situation hasn't been resolved. Really, neither has the bread crisis. But this is where they decided to focus in mid-August. It was one of those key provisions in the Tennis Court Oath. Remember, it's mentioned twice in the Tennis Court Oath when we talked about that, I think 3 episodes ago, that the establishment of a constitution for France was one of the key things. That was one of these things these guys were taking oaths for, and they would not separate until it was done, right? Remember, everyone pretty much on the board here was there except for the king, Jacques Necker. Everyone else was there, and Thomas Jefferson. The whole upper 2 rows, the guys who took that oath, they all agreed, we will not disperse. Wherever we need to meet, we will meet until this constitution is written. It was so central to the identity of the assembly that back in July, on July 7th, we've been calling them the National Assembly the entire time. Excuse me. But on July 7th, they adopted a new name, right? They in June, they adopted National Assembly. Those are Sayes's, original pick for the name of the body. But they changed the name on July 7th to the National Constituent Assembly. And historically, if you look in documents, it's referred colloquially as the National Assembly, the National Constituent Assembly, and just the Assembly. So for the sake of continuity, I will continue to just simply refer to it as the National Assembly, because it's the same body. It didn't change. But it's important to note that from July 7th on, historically, if you're reading books and you see National Constituent Assembly, they mean this. And the term constituent is what was added because of that constitutional identity being so crucial. Constitutional, constituent. They renamed the assembly after the notion of writing a constitution. So, a few days after the renaming, this renaming to the National Constituent Assembly, Lafayette moves. Thank you very much for the follow, Raf Abner, however you pronounce it. Welcome in. Buckle up, as we're talking about the Constitution of 1789, which actually isn't called that, but the writing of the Constitution of 1791 in the summer of 1789. But welcome in. And don't forget, if you want to get a free pack of Streamloots cards, !SL, we'll get you the link and get you into playing some cards that will play some sounds and do some other stuff when we get to the quiz. But a few days after the National Assembly renamed itself to the National Constituent Assembly, Lafayette moves that this new constitution, which is so central to what they're doing, right, even though it's not solving the immediate problem, needs a preamble. And the first day that he introduces this motion to begin work on a preamble, which will later become the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, the very first time he introduces that motion is Friday, July 11th. So if we roll back a couple of episodes, what happens on Saturday, July the 12th? Anybody remember what happened on Saturday, July 12th, which happens to be 2 days before the fall of the Bastille? What happens on that Saturday, the day after Lafayette introduces this measure for a preamble? Anybody in chat want to go ahead and try to pipe up on that one while I get a sip of a drink? Okay. It was when Jacques Necker was fired. Remember, the Queen and the Comte d'Artois kind of built up that military force and felt they were in a strong enough position, and they fired him at dinner, and he didn't even tell anybody at the table. He just got up and left and headed for Switzerland. Yeah, the day before that is when Lafayette introduces for the very first time that the Constitution should have a preamble. So it kind of gets lost in the minutia and the chaos that happens over the next, couple weeks and, the next month and a half, basically, through the fall of the Bastille and the Great Fear in France. So it wasn't until weeks later that Lafayette would raise the matter of this preamble again, this declaration. It's not called that yet, but that's what it'll be. The Monarchians, led by Mounier, object. They don't want a list of rights because they fear that creating a list of rights, and they're thinking, remember, the Bill of Rights exists at this point in the United States, and these guys are all familiar with that. They're looking at that and going, if we create an enumerated list of rights, it will create an unrealistic expectation of delivery of those rights. We don't believe we can just turn around and give what we write down to the people immediately. So it's kind of cynical, right? Because Mounier and the Monarchians were this liberal faction rolling into the Estates General, and they're now slipping further and further and further, to the right, into conservatism. And they're saying, yeah, we really like Enlightenment, freedom principles, but if we write them all down, people are going to expect that. And there's a little bit of truth in that, right? Because when we go back and talk about the Declaration of August 11th, and we see that the National Assembly destroys feudalism in France, no one read past that point, right? They just saw that. So there is a legitimate fear in writing things down that these are your rights, but it is a little cynical to say, hey, we're here destroying the feudal regime. The ancien regime is dead. Let's not write down what they get, though, because how else do people know, right? It seems that people France in this time period, when they saw things being written to paper, they took it to heart. And if you can't deliver the rights that you want to grant these people, maybe you shouldn't be taking care of a constitution right now. Maybe you should be making sure they're fed first. In any event, over these objections, the Assembly approved the motion, wait for it, on the afternoon of August the 4th, which you all remember, the evening of August the 4th is when feudalism dies in France. So yet again, the timing of the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizens progression through the Assembly is just jaw-droppingly coincidental with major other things that happened in France. And so because of it, it gets put on the back burner again, because that's the night that everybody was one-upping everybody else and destroying hunting rights, and the tithe dies and all that stuff. So they don't really come back around to the Declaration of Rights of Man until, a couple weeks later. But Lafayette, this was his thing. Lafayette was an idealist, and when we talk about a lot of the guys in here, like the Comte de Mirabeau is one of them, and we go back to talk about Talleyrand when we come back to him, a lot of these guys are political opportunists. They are all about what they can get from the system, and for instance, leveraging violence to get to a political end, like the Breton Club has done. Lafayette's not that guy. Historically, he is not a bad guy, and this is his pet project. He wants this done, so he continues to push for it. He believed that if a written declaration was done, it would add this level of dignity to everything that's happened, right? Because a lot of people, but the representatives, the delegates are all men, so a lot of guys came into this with noble intent, and they watched this summer transpire where, people are dying, and, the intendant of France is beheaded after things are kind of settled down in Paris, supposedly, but people are having their heads chopped off. at, the fall of the Bastille. We've got a board of dead people sitting above this on the whiteboard of just people who were outright murdered. And Lafayette wants to bring this air of dignity back to what's happening. And it'll be a futile cause, but it speaks to whom he is. He is this gentleman. He was, and it's no shocker, right? He was taught military tactics under Hamilton and Washington. And he senses that noble feel from what he perceives to be occurring in the United States, even though it was basically a tax revolt. And he carries that home. And he wants to see that same air of nobility that he perceives placed onto what's occurring in France. Whereas other gentlemen, like Mirabeau and Barnave and Sayes, they're a little bit more cynical, sneaky guys. Lafayette's just not that guy. As we progress through this, and Lafayette's going to hang around way past this series, right? He's going to hang around into the the Bourbon Restoration and the Revolution of 1830, and he's consistently this guy. And we're going to profile Lafayette more in depth as we kind of say goodbye to him from the perspective of the Revolution down the road. But I want you to understand that's his motivation. That sources all say that this guy was genuinely a good guy. And there are far too few good guys in the French Revolution. So, Lafayette spends early August, like after it's been tabled and then tabled again, he continually keeps working on drafts. He is this fanciful optimist, which would put him in contrast with me because I'm a cynic. But he has optimistic, idealistic notions about what this document, this preamble, should be. And he incorporates many of the Enlightenment principles we've talked about over and over and over from Voltaire and Montesquieu and even some stuff from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He leans on Montesquieu and Rousseau, which is surprising because Rousseau is kind of anti-Enlightenment. But the ideas that these gentlemen have been presenting for 70 years and beyond during the French Enlightenment period and the Scientific Revolution, he's bringing those concepts into this document. He looks to the Bill of Rights because the U.S. is to Lafayette his second home. He feels more closely tied to the United States than pretty much anybody else in the Assembly because he fought there. Lamette fought there too. Many, many other French officers fought there, but Lafayette feels this very intrinsic tie to what has happened in the United States can happen here. And then he sought guidance from the U.S. ambassador to France at the time, Thomas Jefferson, the first of two times I will mention Jefferson tonight. He went to Jefferson's house. He was familiar with Jefferson. They were friends. And he went to Jefferson, who, you'll remember, wrote the Declaration of Independence, right? So he went there because Lafayette was not the writer that Jefferson was, and asked for Jefferson to work on the drafts of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, and Jefferson has his hand in it. And then the drafts pass under the pen of another gentleman. This gentleman on the middle row, far right, Henri Gabriel Riquetti, the Comte de Mirabeau. And we've mentioned the Comte de Mirabeau before. If you remember that royal session of the Estates General that supremely failed when the king came out and said, the taxes are still a thing. I don't care what the National Assembly, whatever that is, but what I'm still king. The estates are still a thing, and you will pay your taxes. And then he left and told everybody to leave. Remember, the Third Estate didn't leave. Mirabeau was the guy in the crowd of the Third Estate who stood up and basically said, "You're going to have to bring in the guys with the guns." He was that guy in that moment. We've mentioned him before, but he's going to become significantly more important for a short period of time, and then we're going to say bye-bye to him as well. So we're going to spend a moment here while we talk about the rights of man, kind of profiling Mirabeau, because this is a really good chance to do so. Mirabeau was born in 1749, which makes him older than he's 10 to 15 years older than a lot of the core famous faces from the French Revolution. He's kind of on par with Talleyrand in terms of his age. He was a fifth child and the second son of a noble family. And second sons of noble families, I'm sorry, but it sucks to be you in the Ancien regime and in feudal times. And it just was one of these things where the first son was going to inherit, right? So the second son had to find a way to make an income that was going to be meaningful after his parents passed away. And Mirabeau was not very good at it. He survived smallpox at the age of 3 years old, but it left his face disfigured. There's a reason in the painting that I have up there that he's facing the way he is, because he's hiding scars from the other side. The side profile The left side profile of Mirabeau is seen. I see it a lot, and I don't see his scarring represented in drawings and paintings unless he's front or right profiled. I'm sorry, left profiled is where I see it. Right profile is where I don't. But either way, these are commissioned paintings, right? So there's not photographs of this guy. It's really hard to see where he was disfigured by it, but it's accounted for in many sources that the Comte de Mirabeau was disfigured by smallpox, and he was a big guy too. There are two disfigured big men in the French Revolutionary period that are really famous. Mirabeau is one of them. Georges Danton will be the other one, but we're going to get to him, even though he's kind of been doing stuff in the background. We're going to bring him to the stage here in a little while. But Mirabeau is disfigured by smallpox. He's, like I said, this giant hulk of a man. And he dressed ostentatiously. He dressed so that you would know he was there. So a big,
Remember
scarred,
to clonk that follow button.
flamboyantly dressed man. It's hard to miss in a crowd. He was the black sheep of his family, and it's amazing he never ended up in the Bastille, but he didn't. Remember, the Bastille was not just for prisoners, but also for that member of our family is really misbehaving, and we need to teach them a lesson, so we're going to send them to the Bastille for vacation. Noble families did that a lot via purchased lettres de cachet. Mirabeau never got hit by one of those. But as he grew up, he had numerous high-profile public affairs with married women. He was a gambler, and not a very good one. He just stockpiled these massive gambling debts. And then, to help pay off those debts, he blackmailed a very wealthy widow into marrying him so that he could gild his estate from what she had and pay down some of his debts. So the idea here is that Mirabeau is going to be, for a short time in French Revolutionary history, revered by the people, right? And he is looked to as an example of rebellious behavior kind of nobly because of his activities at that royal session. And he was a gifted writer. But he's not a great human being. He was frequently the target of the basic lettres de cachet from the crown, because he couldn't keep his mouth shut, and he liked to be the center of attention. And in his writings, he really didn't care what he was writing because people were paying him to write. And effectively, if you could pay him to help him pay down his debt, he would put his pen down and write whatever you wanted him to. He found himself in various states of imprisonment and exile from France entirely in his youth. He bounced between France and the Netherlands, and like I said, he just hired out his pen. That's how he paid his bills. He was a very gifted writer. And because he was a gifted writer, he would just be your propagandist. What do you need written? I'll be that guy. And there's a parallel here, right? Because we have people like this in our modern media, where they don't have a conscience about what they put out as news. They're willing to take your dime to use their bullhorn and their celebrity to say whatever you want them to say. And Mirabeau was one of the early examples of that really bad thing, where just pay somebody who has the soapbox, has the bullhorn, has the pulpit to say what you want them to say for the highest level dispersion of your message, the highest and greatest number of impressions, if you would, to take the parlance of our times, where we're talking about ad impressions and things like that. Mirabeau is an example of that, where he just didn't care. He didn't care what you were asking him to write down as long as your check cleared. And for anything else about him, it speaks volumes about who he is as a principled individual, that he was just willing to do that. You know, debt is what it is, and he created his own problems. But at the end of the day, there are noble and principled ways to climb out of that hole, and then there are sinister and close to evil ways of doing that. And he was more on the side of the latter. In the early 1780s, he was once again exiled. He's been exiled a bunch of times, but he was exiled again. But during this exile is when he penetrates the popular consciousness, right? He becomes Yes way. He becomes just a celebrity. He's a known name, in some circles, but he becomes a national figure where he is just known. Everyone, it's kind of like Jean-Sylvain Bailly, in a sense, where everyone in France knows who Jean-Sylvain Bailly is, right? He's a famous scientist and astronomer. He's now currently the mayor of France, or of Paris. But Mirabeau in the 1780s penetrates that veil and becomes that super celebrity. And he did so by doing two basic things. The first was, shocker, he wrote a really just burning critique of the use of lettres de cachet. And remember, this is a time when that concept was being used by the crown to, get its business done. And it was entirely self-serving for Mirabeau to write this, because for his entire life, he'd been targets of these letters himself. And he was currently exiled at the time via one. So, sure, it served his purpose to write this scathing retort of lettres de cachet. It also fit in with the momentum of the times, to where he was speaking words that the pre-revolutionary churn wanted to hear. So that catapults him into a state of super celebrity, along with, and he's married at the time, a series of dirty love letters between himself and a woman named Sophie. And, I mean, porn is porn, and this is basically like publishing letters to Penthouse, so it makes him more famous, even though ethically it's questionable. So after he's in the Netherlands, which is called the United Provinces at this time, the Dutch Republic as it's shown up in the upper portion of the map on the screen right now, he goes to Berlin for a piece. And while he's there, he writes another bestseller, or he gathers material for what will be another bestseller, which he writes called The History of the Court of Berlin. And it's basically like spy material, where Mirabeau was just gathering intel on how the Prussians worked as an empire. Remember, this is the court that has been handed down from Frederick the Great. And when it comes back and gets published, this work is so vicious against the Prussians and popular enough with the people, because Mirabeau's a known guy now, that it becomes a bit of a diplomatic incident. And it factors into, remember way back when, the bankruptcy is declared and France doesn't go to assist the Dutch, the United Provinces, because they can't afford to. Prussian thinking at the time is influenced by this book that Mirabeau wrote. And because it's such a diplomatic firestorm that is out there, and it's a problem for Prussia, that it's true, a lot of what Mirabeau is writing is true, that Brienne has to, at the time, it is still Brienne who's first minister, Brienne is forced to make diplomatic concessions to Prussia to say, whoa, we'll go get this, we'll go suppress this book. So state censorship comes into play on this book that Mirabeau wrote. He's never working toward a goal that would be deemed noble. Like he drops this book in the middle of this whole dust up over what's going on in the Netherlands and creates another problem for France, but he didn't care because he had to pay his bills, he had to pay his debts. The French royal ministry under Brienne, again, promised to suppress that book. And while this whole build-up to the Estates General was occurring, he's actually allowed to come back to France for whatever reason. I think because the whole idea, the notion of lettres de cachet, exiling citizens, is becoming increasingly politically bad for the crown to endure. He comes back and he actually joins that. Remember, Adrien Duport had that Society of 30, the liberal nobles who were all going to work together to free the Third Estate, and they made the pamphlets and taught everyone how to make petitions to put them in Necker's inbox to just really influence how things are going to roll into the Estates General. Mirabeau joins that group, and that does speak to that as well, right? Because here's Mirabeau, and people know who he is. He's a debtor, an adulterer, and a political opportunist, and yet, because he politically agrees with Duport and Talleyrand, and Lafayette's in that group too, he's allowed to kind of join that group. Sayes is there too. He's elected as a delegate to the National Assembly from two constituencies. I've highlighted one of them on the map. It's in the bottom lower right in Provence. He's elected from Aix and Marseille, and he accepts the appointment to the National Assembly, or at that point the Estates General, from Provence. And a little side note, from Aix. He accepts from Aix. So he kind of says to Marseille, thank you, but I'm going to accept the appointment from the good people of Aix, and he goes to the Estates General. But side note about Provence. It's called Provence because it was simply known as the province in Roman times. It was just on the other side of the Alps. It was part of Transalpine Gaul, and it was just another piece of territory the Romans acquired and just became known as the province. Julius Caesar helped make it very famous, as did Hannibal. But anyway, that's why it's called Provence. But again, Mirabeau elected by the good citizens of Aix, and he is the States General. He was one of the few delegates of the National Assembly who had national name recognition, right? The Bailly was the other big one, where no matter where you went in France, if you said his name, people knew him. Bailly, due to his scientific fame, Mirabeau, due to his authorship, being a prolific writer, and he had a really bad reputation. But that didn't seem to bother people at the time. Like his adultery and his gambling debt, that didn't seem to really dig people as much as it probably digs me. Where I don't consider him to be a good man, but that definition of what makes a good man is contemporary to me in our times. I don't have a frame of reference for what general civic society was in France during the time of Mirabeau, so I don't think he's a good guy, but that didn't seem to bother many other people. So as the assembly gets rolling, though, Mirabeau begins to position himself as a leader. And again, he was the one who dared the crown to send in the troops during that failed royal session of the Estates General right before the Estates General failed, right, and became the National Assembly, for real, and with the stamp of the king. He came down in line with the more moderate Monarchians as the Great Fear swept the nation and people started to encamp themselves as we're going to leverage this, or this is appalling, the destruction of property is appalling, these people are breaking their contracts. He fell down on the more central conservative side of things with Mounier and the Monarchians. He didn't follow along with the Breton radicals and the Paris radicals, because Breton and Paris, they're kind of where the radical core of things are. So he is the reason why, because of that moderate kind of leaning as the summer rolls on, that as Lafayette's asking him to pass his pen over the drafts of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, that a lot of Lafayette's more fanciful, idealistic language is tempered and toned down into something that's more realistic. And again, remember, the Monarchians, and I hate to group them all as a groupthink, it's dangerous to do that, but in general, those individuals who you can identify as aligning themselves with the Monarchians were not really that much in favor of drafting this document. So Mirabeau kind of breaks with them a little bit and says, yeah, sure, I'll help. I think he does so because he realizes that even though it might be dangerous given the way things have gone that summer to write these things down, eventually it's going to happen, and why wouldn't he want to have his name on it somewhere? Because again, the dude's is nothing is self-serving. Okay, so moving from Mirabeau, there's a good background on who he is, I think, and I'm trying to be as objective as possible, but facts are facts, and I am interpreting a little bit on there to be like, publishing adulterous love letters is probably not the action of a good person. So in late August, the drafts that had passed under the pen of Jefferson and passed under the pen of Mirabeau begin to be considered by the full assembly. And all of these drafts try to encapsulate, they try to grab this concept, and this is, I'm going to say the word nebulous probably 10 times tonight, but this concept of what is known historically as the principles of 1789. Like, what was this all about? What was the assembly doing? What did the people need and want? Is all this notion of the principles of 1789, this base idea of what the revolution was all about. The drafts all try to collectively encapsulate these ideas. So it's, if there was a theory of political revolution in 1789 in France, you could call it the principles of 1789. It's not a political theory so much as it is a listing of outcomes or list of desired states, but again, it's this nebulous thing where if you were going to talk about what the central guiding ideology of the National Assembly as a whole was in this end of the summer, it is this idea, this principles of 1789. And we're going to get to what goes in the document, so don't worry. I'm going to kind of elaborate on what those things are. The individuals, so some of the principles are right here. Individuals had natural rights, which had to be respected, such as liberty, property, security, and VT, vengeful torture. 50 bits toward DAV. Appreciate it very much. For those of you that are hanging out and don't know, bits, subs, and Streamloots pack buys go to disabled American veterans post taxes. If you sub at tier 3, I do take that extra money and apply it to licenses for software to let me do things like this. But VT, thank you very much. So, again, we're going to talk about those ideas that kind of encapsulate the principles of 1789 one more time. The idea that individuals had natural rights. Natural rights go beyond the notion of divine right? It's intrinsic to the concept of nature that man has certain rights among each other, such as liberty, property, security. And that idea of liberty, remember, liberty was liberty of privilege up until, a few weeks ago when the Declaration of August 11th was put out. But liberty is another one of those what is liberty concepts, right? And you can go down a rabbit hole on this. Liberty, to a lot of people, is freedom. Well, what's freedom? Is freedom the ability to do, say, what you want, where you want, at all times without any consequence? Because that's anarchy. Or is freedom the ability to work within a sufficiently defined state that protects you and keeps foreign enemies and invaders from doing things to you while allowing you to basically conduct your life the way you want? Because if you want that, that's communism. That's what China has. I hate to say it. So the idea of freedom is really, really nebulous. And again, it's a great word. Nebulous describes so many things. It's this vague concept. So saying that everyone is entitled to freedom, we have this Western definition of what that is. Freedom to us is, freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of expression and freedom of thought. Those are all definitely freedoms. But you're not free to drive a car without a license. You're not free to vote until you're 18. So what is freedom becomes really an interesting thing to debate. And it's not clearly defined within what is freedom according to the principles of 1789. Another portion of these principles of 1789 is political sovereignty lay with the nation and its people as a whole, and not with a divine or absolute monarch. So it strikes completely, like the idea of an absolute or divine monarch strikes completely at the Ancien regime, and especially who Louis XIV was. The idea that sovereignty is derived from the people. That's something that any democratic republic is going to believe in. The United States does. Any Western democracy believes that sovereign power is derived from a mandate from the masses, to quote Monty Python. And it's true. Sovereign power in a democracy comes from this majority rules concept of the people's will. And it is one of the things that the delegates in 1789 believed in. They believed that, no, the king doesn't have sovereign authority unless it's granted to him by the people, which is why we have to write a constitution in the first place. Participations by citizens in their own government was a prerequisite for any law or tax to be legal. So without this sovereignty derived from the masses applied to a system of government, that government could not pass a law or tax that could be considered legal. Again, look to our own representative republic functions that way. The problem is that most people don't pay attention to what they do. But at the end of the day, we elect representatives and senators in the United States. In the UK, they elect members of parliament. They do something, I believe there's two, a bicameral legislature in Canada as well, where you're not representing yourself directly, but you're voting for someone to represent your interests in these legislatures. And that is granting that sovereign power derived from the people to those individuals to be in those bodies. So in turn, those laws and taxes become legal. That's enshrined in the principles of 1789. And the rule of law is essential to a just society. And how that law was to be considered is as an expression, and this is important, of the general will. Now, the general will, and this term appears in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The general will is not the same as the majority will. And it creates this philosophical and legal opening for the idea that despite what the masses want, we know better, right? We will act in their interest because the sovereign powers, the people who generate the sovereign power that they've given us are dumb. Or because we want to do something different because it benefits ourselves. And that, the general will, or you can point to the Senate of the United States and pick out that one, but it's a dangerous thing in France in this period of history because it's going to be very, very easy to divorce the concept of majority will or the thing that will benefit the majority of people most from this concept of general will. And the general will be leveraged as a key vehicle during the Reign of Terror as to why the Reign of Terror does what it does. And it's enshrined in this moment in the preamble to the Constitution and this document that's about to become known as the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It's, again, there's no clear definition. It's this cloudy, nebulous, abstract concept, the general will, that just allows savvy individuals to basically be able to justify anything. They can point to this and say, well, it's in the best interest of the general will. What's that? Well, it's the general will. What's that? Well, if you go back and look at the principle of 1789, and you could talk around the answer forever and point back to the general will is what allows me to do this. And that's scary. Which is why having an enumerated Bill of Rights in the United States, in my opinion, is better than having a list of more abstract and vague concepts of rights, which is what the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen will eventually become. So, some of the aspects of the early drafts were reined in by the increasingly conservative Monarchians. And remember, we're a year. It's only been a year, basically, since the Day of the Tiles, right? Which is down in Dauphine, which is where Mounier comes from. It's also, I believe, where Barnave comes from. But those guys were on the edge, the leading edge of liberal, radical politics in France 1 year ago. And now they are the ones shifting further and further to the right, becoming, well, we've kind of got what we want out of this, and maybe we shouldn't go too far overboard. And they probably were right. At the end of the day, when you see what happens here in the next couple of years in France, the idea of, should they have stopped right there when they were ahead? Probably. But you'll remember that the body is over 1,200 delegates, right? And their factions weren't that big. So it was really hard to get the reins and keep momentum going in a specific direction for a long time. We're actually going to talk about an example of that in a little while. So we're not going to go line by line through the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, but we are going to highlight some very key elements of it, just so that there is a decent frame of reference for how these things were being worded. And then, again, in comparison, you can go back to the Bill of Rights in the United States is a decent comparative document simply because it is considered foundational, right? And the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen will also be considered foundational. Where we have in Article 1 where that girl, Fletch, thank you for the resub in support of DAV. I appreciate it. Welcome back. It's good to see you. As we talk about the French Revolution, it is very good to see you, Fletch. So again, we don't clearly state what our rights are in the Bill of Rights, but we do it a whole lot better than what they did in 1789 in France. We have very clear definitions of the right. Host as well. Thank you very much. It's all right, Fletch. That's why we do VODs for these series, because they're super long and, you can go catch up on what we've been talking about. But the Bill of Rights does a decent job of saying, citizens of the United States, well, it's citizens is a vague. Do people in the United States have the right to free speech and free assembly and freedom of worship and freedom of press? Those are pretty clearly outlined examples of rights that are just stated outright. These things are facts. These are things that people in the United States can do. And that's not how things are worded in the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And yes, I'm reading an English translation of a French document, but French scholars also say the same thing, that this is not a concrete list of enumerated rights. It's also much longer than the Bill of Rights. So the first article of the Declaration of Rights of Man, and I'm going to start saying the Declaration of Rights of Man because and of the Citizen is just going to become cumbersome to keep on saying, right? So when I say the Declaration of Rights of Man, I mean the same document. It says, men are born and remain free and equal in rights, which later on is qualified with social distinctions may only be founded on the general good. Whatever that is. general good, the general will. These terms are being thrown into this flowery language of these articles, and it's going to create these philosophical, intellectual openings for, again, savvy, opportunistic people like, Maximilian Robespierre, among others. This establishes the principle of equality, right? It establishes that, again, men, and that's the times, I'm sorry, ladies, but that's the times, men are born free and equal in rights. But the qualifier also permits the existence of a social hierarchy. Now remember, we just got done dismantling a social hierarchy, like not even a couple weeks ago. Feudalism falls. The three estates are an example of a hierarchical system that was increasingly problematic to the evolution of personal freedom, liberty, rights, property, everything in France. And what do they do in the very first article of the document? Say, it's okay to have a hierarchy because, we here in the assembly are at the top of the old one. And it creates this other ill-defined concept, the general good, right? What's the general good? What's the general will? It's just, without it, it leads you into a situation where, if we were talking about the American Constitution, then we get into the argument of, originalism versus modern interpretationalism of a founding document. What did our founding fathers mean is something you see all the time. Well, what did the founding fathers of France in the National Assembly in 1789 mean by? Hey, Mads, what do they mean by the idea of general will and general good?
And then when she plays Overwatch, you could snowball Andy.
They don't outline what those terms mean. Yeah, exactly, Doc. It is a matter of perspective as to what general good means because, and again, I don't like to get political during these history streams, but it's important to align these things to modern politics because there are a ton of parallels. You could say that regardless of your political affiliation, and I don't care what it is, but you could say that the more right-leaning politicians in this country can claim that the general good is their reasoning for doing something, say, for instance, introducing a law with respect to what can or can't be done with transgender individuals, right? The general good suggests that we should take this law down this road. You can see how this concept becomes something that you can latch onto as your reasoning, and it's extremely dangerous. Whereas
remember to clunk that follow button.
Right? That in the name of the general good for the people that are affected under these barbaric and outdated concepts of what defines, gender, that we have to have laws that effectively abolish those notions for the general good. And you see how that idea becomes very dangerous. That you can vehicleize it for whatever reason you want to further your own agenda. And that's why the general will and the general good are just scary bad. The second thing that's important to talk about within the articles of the Declaration of the Rights of Man is complete freedom of thought runs into significant opposition from the clerical delegation, regardless of if they're really radical, and most of the radicals are probably more apt to accept this, but across the spectrum, the clerics in the delegation, which is the priests and the bishops, oppose the notion, shocker, of the idea of freedom of thought. And it would be amended to say that freedom of thought, and I'm paraphrasing, that freedom of thought was okay so long as it did not threaten public order. So what's public order? Because who defines what public order is? The clerics are basically saying that, public order is defined by the church, and because we say what is or is not moral, we can define what is or is not in the interest of public order. But again, it's another concept within this document that what's public order? Who defines morally, legally, what public order is? Is public order simply not rioting in the streets because then a police force can accomplish that? But are we talking about thought control? Like you're not allowed to be a Protestant. Is Protestantism against the public order? And I bet you any money the Catholic delegates at the assembly all thought that, or a lot of them thought that, to where they were saying, hey, it's against the public order to allow Protestants to aspire to the things that were just written down in the Declaration of August 11th, one of which included any citizen is able to attain any office. And you remember one of the reasons that Kerr could not attain the position of first minister early on was because he was a Protestant. So taking this idea that the public order is what is threatened by freedom of thought, and you can take freedom of thought to mean freedom of expression, that you cannot express your thought freely if it threatens the public order. not ill-defining these vague concepts, which were flowery just aphorisms at the time to say, we are thinking of things such as the general good and the general will and public order, without defining them in what will be the basic legal document for your constitution, where things derive from, where these laws and rights are defined. Leaving them vague is dangerous, and it's dangerous across the board. It's dangerous in certain aspects in our own Constitution of the United States, or my own Constitution. I shouldn't group everyone as American. I hate to do that. I try not to. But in the Bill of Rights of the United States, there are certain absolute rights that you can just spell out cleanly, and then you get into crazy things like, what does the right to bear arms mean? Because that's not clearly defined. I have my own interpretation of that, and if you go talk to 5 people down the street, they're going to have a different interpretation of that, and talk to 10 lawyers, they're going to have different interpretations of what the Second Amendment in the United States says. And it's the ill definition of a right that has caused a ton of problems. And you can parallel that ill definition of the Second Amendment in the U.S. Bill of Rights to the ill definition of general will, general good, public order. These things are all really just... I can leverage those concepts in a logical argument to do anything I want. And 1984 by George Orwell could leverage the concept of public order to do anything it wanted to. So it's really tough to read through the Declaration of the Rights of Man and go, that was a good idea. The concepts, again, these are guys who still are relatively political novices. Less than a third of them had real political experience, and here they are writing down with the influence of political philosophy from Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu, and trying to interpret that political philosophy into law, because that's what at the end of the day this is. It's important to note that the U.S. Bill of Rights, at its core, is intended to be a straight set of enumerated rights. And you get into an argument of, well, if it's not an enumerated right, is it a right that people have? And that's a great constitutional question. It's designed to be a set of judicial guidelines. However, the Declaration of the Rights of Man is this far more cloudy document. It's not as simple to draw a line from articles within the Declaration of the Rights of Man and to the application of those rights as law. And that's going to be a reason why this Constitution is going to fail. Spoiler alert, but it's impossible to talk about without talking about its flaws. It's much more open to this ambiguous interpretation and application by whomever held power at any given time. And again, to come back to the point that the delegation at the National Assembly is huge, right? There are 100 senators in the U.S. Senate. There are 435 members of the, and I probably am wrong on that. I don't have that number memorized, but it's 420, 430-ish members of the House of Representatives in the U.S., and that's big. And you take that, and it's not even half the size of the National Assembly. I should have just said, if you combine the Senate and House of Representatives, it's not even half. Yeah, it would have been better than making an error, but that's the whole point. The combined bicameral legislature of the U.S. is smaller than half of the size of the delegation of the National Assembly. So it's really hard for who held power at a given time to remain constant. So opportunistic groups of individuals who will leverage what is written down in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which will survive the failing of the Constitution that is about to be written. It's going to constantly change hands for a while, where it's kind of like who is dealing in a game of cards will be different every round. So whom controls power, therefore, can leverage these very vague concepts will never be concrete enough for this defined direction, whether good or bad. The direction that will define these gray areas. It's just never going to go down one road long enough for it to get the momentum it needs to become basically, oh, that's how that works. We didn't define it, but we can write some additional things, like the Federalist Papers were written to kind of addendamize the intent behind the Constitution. It never gets to that point. But the Declaration is finally passed on August 26th, 1789, and immediately becomes the scripture document of the Revolution. Despite the impracticality...
No way!
Yes way. Despite the impracticality of turning over the next day and implementing it immediately. It's just not possible. So we've been going for about almost an hour, but I didn't want to break until we kind of got past the declaration. So we got point 1 of the 4 points down there done. Kind of outlining what the document was, who its principal architects were, and really what it said. The important pieces about what it said. It's really, you can go out. Mike Duncan, by the way, who does a podcast called Revolutions, has an episode where he completely reads the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And I lean on Mike Duncan a lot for this podcast. It's his podcast for this show because he helped me derive a framework for how I wanted to progress through things based on a lot of the other sources. So a lot of credit goes to him. So if you want to go find him, again, it's Mike Duncan. The podcast is called Revolutions. He has a whole section on the French Revolution, and he has a specific episode which he verbatim reads the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And that's just too long for this format, which is why I just highlighted where basically some of the ill-defined things were, some of the problems were, and where some of the contradictions were, so that we understood what we were getting as a product, right? Because that's the important thing. But we're going to talk about that next piece, and of the citizen, when we come back. What is a citizen? Again, it's not just as simple as, well, you were born in France, you were a citizen, because that would have made too much sense. But we'll define what did not make sense and how they define what a citizen is when we get back from break. So make sure you stand up, get a drink, walk around, stretch your legs, and we will be back in just a few minutes. Thanks for hanging out, everybody, tonight. Thanks for your bits and subs, and for the hosts and the follows. Hopefully, Rafabner is in here, and hopefully I'm saying that right. Hopefully you're having fun in your first ever episode of history, and we'll be back in just a few minutes.
Excellent!
Let's rock!
Welcome back. So, before we go any further, and I didn't want to do this in the middle of my flow earlier, but I'm going to toss a shout out that's usually not a part of my normal stuff here. This gentleman, Vengeful Torture, go give the dude a follow. Obviously, look, he says he's playing Monster Hunter Stories 2 Wings of Ruin, which is a game I'm currently no-lifing. Plays a ton of Monster Hunter. Seriously fun. Doesn't have time for anyone's BS, just like me. So, seriously, if you guys enjoy just real people, go give him a follow. Got some cool Monster Hunter swag in his shop as well, but I would appreciate it if you'd click the link there in chat, take a minute, go out to his channel, just drop that follow, give him 30 minutes of your time, and see if you like what he's doing, and hang out in there and have some fun, regardless of if you enjoy Monster Hunter or not. He's a genuinely decent person to just hang out with, and kind of aligns with a lot of the way a lot of the members of the Outlaw community kind of think, where it's like, yeah, whatever, I don't have time for your nonsense. That's kind of what VT's thing is. And I enjoy hanging out in there. Mads, thank you for the resub while we were gone. 13 months. Really appreciate it. Fletch, if I didn't say thanks before, thank you as well. And again, Diggity, Dr. Death at Tier 3, and Rocket, all very much thank you for the resubs. And then VT again for the 50 bits earlier. All benefiting DAV, apart from that Tier 3, which also helps me pay for things like, Photoshop. So we're going to get back to things here. You'll notice I did highlight some things on the map on the left. X being where Mirabeau was elected from. Dauphine, Brittany. Paris, with Brittany is where a lot of the radical sentiment originates from. Paris, obviously, you just want to know where it is, and also radical sentiment there as well. And then Dauphine, which originally was the radical, left-leaning, super progressive element of the country, and now it's becoming more and more the source of, more conservative thinking. So, what is a citizen? So, one of the reasons the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen was written was to define what is a citizen. And you would think that suffrage, meaning the right to vote, would be something that would be granted to all men of a certain age, as it was in the American Constitution. But no, that is not what they decided to do. It would take a few months, right? This isn't happening completely in August to September, but within the definition of the Constitution, what is a citizen would be split into two types of citizens. Because why not make it simple when you can make it complicated, France? The first were active citizens. And the definition for an active citizen is a property-owning male, aged 25 or older, who could not be classified as a servant. If you fit that description, again, property-owning males aged 25 or older who could not be classified as a servant, you got to vote, among many other privileges. Everybody else, it's what's called a passive citizen. Great, right? It was perfectly in line with Enlightenment philosophy that voice in government without an ownership stake, like without owning land or property, was just, it didn't make sense. You had to have this stake. And the idea of a stake in government goes way back to Roman times, like way, way back. Before there was an empire in Rome, you couldn't serve in the army unless you owned property. And that had to be amended by Marius in the lead up to the fall of the Republic, because they were fighting too many wars and there were not enough property owners. But originally, to be a legionnaire in Rome, you had to own property. You had to have a stake in the state. And that concept is, almost 1900 years old at this time. And here it is. It's still part of Enlightenment philosophy that you must have a stake of ownership in the state to be a participant in the state. And that is the real driving reason behind why there is this division of types of citizens, is because everybody on the board, pretty much, except for King Louis the 16th, everybody else is a student of the Enlightenment. And they all believed in that principle, and there was not a whole lot of thought beyond what kind of problem will this cause. And we can see the writing on the wall, right? And we've got the benefit of 200 more years. We can see the problem that would cause. What do you mean I'm not a citizen if I don't own a piece of property? And we can take it to more recently in France, where when the Third Estate delegates met, when the Third Estate assemblies met to elect their delegates, and then to elect their, they elect their electors, then they elect their delegates. When they went through the cahiers, they really wrote off the issues that were affecting the non-property owners, right? The general working classes. They were just tossed in the bin because the bourgeoisie said, this is what's really important. because they were, again, working from their background as, students of the Enlightenment. They knew better. And it's, again, we talked about how that division several episodes ago is going to become a problem. This is how it manifests. The idea that there's going to be two different classes of citizens within a rights document that already allows for a hierarchy of classes to be reestablished. So, of the 30 million people that lived in France at this time, it could only be claimed, the active citizen moniker, like you are an active citizen, could only be claimed by about 4 million people. So 30 million people, only 4 million were active citizens. And that's about 13%. It creates this brand new shadow aristocracy of landowners, which was much like how the old first and second estate worked, right? Landowners, first and second estate owned 43% of the land. The crown owned a big portion of it as well, and then everyone else is kind of fighting to get into that class. It reestablishes that to a degree where you're not a full citizen unless you were part of what used to be the aristocracy. So it creates the shadow aristocracy of active citizens. Only active citizens can vote. And very importantly and initially, only active citizens could go join the National Guard, which is why I made the reference to Rome, because Roman legionnaires had to own land. Initially, remember, the guard's a month old, and the guard was not formed by landowners. It was formed by mobs. And then the Paris electors, which soon became the Paris civic government, said, oh, let's organize this, right? And then Lafayette takes command of it, and it's morphed. It's morphed away from the notion of everybody is a part of this citizen militia into you have to be a land-owning citizen, and this is eventually, you have to be a land-owning citizen to be a member of the Guard. And there's reasons why they did it. We're going to cover the reasons why, one of the reasons next week for sure. We talk about when the Paris housewives had enough and took a trip to Versailles. But it's contradictory to the entire basic original formation of the National Guard as a civic guard of the people. Now it's being turned into a guard of the aristocrats. Again, passive citizens, everybody else. Anybody who wasn't 25, who didn't own land, or who was a servant. If you fell into those things, you were not going to get the right to vote. Obviously going to become a problem down the road as it perpetuates one of the two causes of the revolution and of societal conflict in general. We can get into, again, in a parallel to modern times where those who are entitled by wealth and possession of property and those who are not. I'll clonk your follow button anytime, buddy. It's good to see you in here, my friend. But we have the same dichotomy in this, in the United States for sure, but in Western society in general, where you have the whole argument of the 99 versus 1%, where so many people, so few people possess so much of a percentage of the capitalist wealth of the world, and that's kind of the same. We have a problem with that, right? Those who do not have a problem with the haves having that, and that's going to be one of the problems in France, is the have-nots in terms of votes and rights against the haves, who have those votes and rights simply because they're wealthy and can own property and their gender. You can compare this to the same debate against lords versus serfs and feudalism, the ancien regime's three estates, the active versus passive aristocracy, or the active versus passive citizens, or the aristocracy versus the sans-culottes in France in this period. And again, in the modern times, you can compare this with wealth buying power and privilege in middle and lower classes in modern capitalism. There's these divides that we never learn from, that we continue to perpetuate in our societies, and we don't understand why they're problematic. Why do we have these issues where those who do not have, and there are reasons why those who do not have, right? A lot of it has to do with birth and opportunity. I'm not going to get into a large portion of this debate, but whom you are at birth will very much dictate your opportunity in life. And if you are born into a wealthy family, you're going to have better opportunity. And that's a problem, because it's been a problem forever. It's been a problem in all these examples I just enumerated, where you are potentially handcuffed. You can break those chains through a lot of work and luck, but most people are not going to. So this active versus passive thing is an example of setting a majority of people up to fail. Further down the road, this qualification of active versus passive citizens is another significant break point for the sans-culottes against the bourgeoisie. And again, it goes back to those electoral assemblies where those cahiers were thrown out and the common grievance was disregarded by the men now in the National Assembly, especially those of the Third Estate. This is going to become a significantly important break point between that unity. And we talked about what happens when the citizen protectors of the assembly, who the average person believed they were in Paris at this time, after they were able to effectively get the king to give them what they wanted and protect the assembly, what happens when the interest of the common person and the interest of the assembly diverge? It's going to diverge over this, among other things. So let's talk about the actual Constitution. With the preamble complete, the assembly they had to start working on the actual Constitution. But having a 1,200 delegate body try to sit down and work on the Constitution is going to be unwieldy, right? You just can't go line by line and draft it with 1,200 pens. It just doesn't work that way. The American Constitution doesn't work that way. Constitutions are usually framed by somebody or a small group of people and then taken to a larger body for item by item consideration. And that's what happened here. Eight people began to work through what would become eventually known as the Constitution of 1791. Mounier gets appointed, along with several of the other monarchians that were critical.
Duke is on deck.
Permanoobe's here! We're going to take a break real quick. My friend Permanoob is here, and I want to do something very special for my friend Permanoob. Welcome in, Perm. I hope you remember last week whenever you told me I was annoying because...
Oh, hello! Welcome to my stream. Shut up, Arky. Okay, Sturf is no help, as usual. Shut up, Rex.
I can regen annoying. No, I can't do that. That's Fix's perk.
I was verbally abused by Permanoob, and you are not alone. And if you want to be not alone, the shirt's in the store. I knew you'd take it well, because this is what we do, and this is why I've been trying to get you in here all week. It's because I wanted to play this joke on you. But if you want a shirt that says, I was verbally abused by Permanoob and you were not alone, go get one in the store. I've been sitting low the whole stream trying to hide the shirt. Yeah, it's called Permabused Anonymous. Me and Gilly came up with the term. The support group for being verbally abused by Permanoob is called Permabused Anonymous. Surf, welcome in as well. Sorry for the break there, but I showed a couple people that joke rolling up. I started working on it immediately last week, so there was time to get the shirt here in time, and time to get one. But I knew you'd take it in stride. Don't worry about being late, my friend. I just been wanting to spring this on you the whole time. You can catch up on the VOD. But I knew you'd take it well because we always throw our jabs back and forth at one another. So welcome in. Permanoob, if you're not following him, go click on the link up there. It's further up in your chat, as is Sturfers. Members of the Outlaws community, you should definitely be following. Can the source of the yelling have a shirt? Yes. If you want a shirt, I mean, I'm sure you look at yourself in the mirror and say, I'm not good at video games. In any event, let's get back to the topic. I'm glad to see you. So, again, this 8-man committee forms to start writing the Constitution of France. And
remember to clonk that follow button.
Don't forget to clonk that follow button. But Mounier and some of the more prominent monarchians are appointed to it, as is the Abbé de Sieyès, which is Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès. Remember, he's a member of the clergy, but he's a Third Estate delegate member of the clergy. He is also more radical. He aligns more with the radicals of Paris and Brittany. So, along with some of his radical friends. So you have this committee of 8 individuals, which is immediately split in half. It's split in half between conservatives and radicals, and it leads to a deadlock. It was set up for deadlock immediately because the individuals who were appointed to it were so disparate in their view of how things should happen. And we're going to talk about the major problems that led to the division, and then what happens as they try to resolve those divisions within the Constitution. And one of those things is the third point tonight, which is the royal veto. But the first major point where these two factions within this committee of 8, which I don't have a better way to describe it because it doesn't have an official name I can find, so we're just going to call it the committee of 8. the first major issue that the Committee of Eight couldn't come to an agreement on was the legislature. How many chambers? How big should it be? How would members of the legislature be elected? Who would be electing them? What would be the scope of their powers? And Mounier and the Monarchians wanted what's known as a bicameral legislature, right? The U.S. Congress is a bicameral legislature, bi meaning two chambers, an upper and lower house. The UK Parliament is also a bicameral legislature, even though people would argue it's really not an elected body. The House of Commons being the lower chamber, and the House of Lords, which is a titular appointment body, form the Parliament, and that's a bicameral legislature. And then the Radicals wanted a unicameral legislature, or a single body legislature, which is what the National Assembly kind of was, right? They wanted this one body to be effectively the government of France, which would box in the king, right? They wanted to take the king and put him in a box and make him a figurehead. That's what the Radicals wanted. So they wanted a unicameral legislature because they felt that that was the one most democratic way to do things, and two, would be the best way to kind of bottle in the king. The second thing that they disagreed on big time was the royal veto. The Monarchians wanted to hand the king an absolute and unlimited veto, which I'm not so sure that's a great idea. I mean, we just got out of an absolute, quote, absolute monarchy, where the king was effectively able to dictate what he wanted to do via lettres de cachet, etc., tyrannically if he wanted to. So handing the king an absolute and forever veto against anything that whatever the legislature looks like will pump out, I think is a bad idea. But the Monarchians were trying to also, remember, rein in chaos, because it had been chaos, and it still kind of is chaos as we roll to the end of August, because that's when the Great Fear finally winds down with the declaration of August 11th. But they're looking to, again, no one wanted to get rid of the king yet. And at this point, it's a debate about what role should the king have within the new government. And the Monarchians really wanted this king to still be king. They wanted more of a constitutional monarchy where realistically the will of the people could still be stamped out by a veto from the king. And then obviously the Radicals didn't want to give him a veto at all. So you have these widely different concepts, right? A veto for anything and everything that is effective for all time and cannot be overturned. That's what the Monarchians wanted. And then you have he shouldn't be able to veto anything. He should do what we say. He should be the executor of the legislative general will of the people. And it's a huge roadblock. This royal veto is a major political roadblock in this Committee of Eight and within these two factions at all. But remember, these two factions make up like the actual voting block of the Monarchians and soon to be organized voting block of the Bretons. They only make up about 500, maybe 400, 500 of the delegates of the National Assembly. And the rest of that middle is really fluid. They can go either way. How the veto would be defined would also define the power balance between the crown and the legislative body. And that's why it was so contentious. Would the king be a puppet figurehead like the Radicals wanted, or would the legislature simply serve as a backdrop for the crown, which is kind of what would happen if you gave the crown an unlimited and absolute veto over all things? And that means like a line item veto. Like you can go through specific things and say, nope, 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 but I like that one. Nope, nope, nope. And there's a middle ground in there that makes a whole lot more sense, right? There's a common ground. And this is where I will talk about modern U.S. politics for a moment, where one side of this argument was so entrenched in it's our way or else that it became a problem. And that was the Monarchians. They were going to dig their heels in and plant their flag on this veto. And sure, Perm, I'll see you shortly. But without the ability to compromise, and the notion of compromise is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, without the willingness to reach a common middle ground where you give, I give, and we find something that makes sense, bad things happen. And I'm not saying bad things happened in the way that the veto came out of this, but without some manner of compromise, and a compromise does finally occur, just people entrench and they don't reach resolution on problems. For the Radicals, the debate of the veto and in turn who would hold power was deadly serious, right? As it was clear to them now, this is the Breton Club and the Paris Radicals, that they were being outmaneuvered by the Monarchians. The Monarchians had formed their after-hours meeting, and they had an executive steering committee, and they were passing out pieces of paper telling people within their faction that we're voting this way for this appointment. This was organized, right? And it went on that way for about 6 to 8 weeks in the summer, where the Breton Club, which is more of a freewheeling evening debate society, and they didn't organize their vote, they came to the realization that, hey, we're losing here. We're losing because they're more organized than we are. And this issue of the veto, should the Monarchians push it through and get what they want, was like seriously threatening the entire concept of what the revolution was to the radicals. If the crown obtained this unlimited veto, the radicals felt that everything that had happened, all the gains, regardless of how they were gained, would be lost. So, a meeting is convened. Welcome back, Mr. Jefferson, for your second and last appearance in the French Revolution. A meeting was organized by Lafayette, because he had this connection with Jefferson from fighting in the American Revolution, to get the principals into a room at Thomas Jefferson's house. In early September, he arranges this meeting of the key players, and look at that, we're into September, finally. It's only taken us 3 episodes. Mounier represents the Monarchians, along with a few others, obviously. The more radical position is represented primarily by a trio of individuals who eventually become the power of the Legislative Assembly for a time. The radical position is represented by Adrien Duport, Antoine Barnave, and Alexandre Théodore Victor de Lameth. And those are the 3 individuals in the middle of your screen. I'm going to zoom in on them for just a second here. These 3 guys are going to be super strong in Paris politics for basically the rest of the time of the existence of the National Assembly, which isn't going to be as long as you think. We're going to profile each one of them a little bit at the end of the episode, just so you can get a decent starting point. We know Duport, right? He was that Paris Parlement member who was pushing for liberal agendas. We don't know the other 2, but we're going to get to the other 2. Also, I wanted to take a moment here and show you what this looked like. These are artist depictions of how these chambers looked at this time. On the left is more the royal session, when Louis would convene the estates and sit down with all the members. And I'm highlighting this to show you the shapes because they are important. The way in which they form in a kind of a horseshoe around Louis, and in the National Assembly, it's more of a open, a large oval where there's just, it's important. And next week we're going to find out why these shapes of how people sat were important when we define some things in the modern era. But I wanted to give you the visual of how people sat during all of these things, and these are good depictions of how they sat. And you're going to be like, well, what the hell does that matter, Fix? It matters, because when you sit with people who agree with you all the time, then it becomes an echo chamber. When you're forced to sit with people you don't agree with all the time, then you're forced to listen to what the other side has to say. And so a divide down the middle of a body that says everyone who thinks this way sits over here and everyone who thinks this way sits over there, I don't know, like the U.S. Senate, that's not the greatest idea in the world for open-minded interactive debate. Yet that's how we have evolved. How we evolved down that line I'm going to talk about next week. But I wanted to set the stage by showing you these 2 artist renderings of how these bodies used to be. The National Assembly here on the right, still kind of in that I sit with the guys who I came to the show with. We share our rooms together. We came on the road to Versailles together. That's going to shift next week. And in the Estates General, it was you sit by order, and then you sit within those, I'm going to sit with the guys I know who I came with. Because remember, this is still only a couple months old. They haven't formed these bonds that would redefine their association so far as I'm going to sit with the people who think like me. We're going to get there, though. But again, I just wanted to show you how it looked. Because how it looks in these 2, where it's more of a circular sort of bending of people around in a concentric shape, it's going to matter, and it's going to change. It's going to change, and it's going to change how people think. But back to Duport, Barnave, and Lameth, which I will zoom back in on just a little bit. The triumvirs, as they will become known as, came to the meeting willing to compromise. They came in, they represented the radical position, Duport, Barnave, and Lameth. No way. Yes way. They came to the meeting willing to say, okay, we want no veto. We understand that there's resistance to that, and we're willing to find a veto that makes sense. But again, Mounier and the more conservative Munarchian faction came in and said, no, unlimited veto forever. And they planted their flag on it. And so the meeting went nowhere. They came out of the meeting and they said nothing, and nothing got done. So it's deadlock. This deadlock that exists from the moment that this assembly is created, this committee of 8 is created, just can't get anything done on these major issues because they are too divergent and, in some cases, too stubborn. So they kick these issues to the full assembly for consideration because they can't resolve them. One, having an even number is a bad idea if you want to resolve anything, but they kick these matters, the legislature, type bicameral or unicameral, and the veto, among many others, but these are the two important ones. They kick them to the full assembly for consideration. And the uncommitted delegates, those ones in the middle, right? Those not radical, not Munarchian delegates, are kind of free-flowing independents at this point. They understand and largely support Mounier's brand of constitutional royalism, this whole idea of the king needs to be not a figurehead, but an active, participating executive of government. But they were just as nervous as the radicals were about just handing him a veto pen that never expired, right? That he had still unilateral authority to say no to the legislature. They were super nervous about it. And then, in his very, very, very last meaningful act in the French Revolutionary period, Jacques Necker steps in with an idea for the compromise. And this is probably the last episode you will see Necker on the opening credits. We might mention what happens to him when, but he becomes a political nobody. So that the very next time he is fired, remember the last time he was fired, buildings burned down and the Bastille was stormed. The next time Necker is fired, no one's going to think twice. Whatever. He was already on a political just down at this point. The assembly was starting to come into its own, and the people who were involved with assembly politics just didn't see him as essential anymore, so defending him also was not essential. But in this moment, Necker steps in and says, hey, I got an idea. He proposes what's called a suspensive veto. And it really was that the king could delay legislation, but not stop it entirely, quote, if the people willed it. Whatever that means. And whatever that means is the crux of everything here. It was greeted by the middle delegates as a good compromise, those independent middle delegates. It was greeted by them as a very good compromise between the conservative total absolute veto and the no veto. But the devil and the danger is in the details of this. How long would a veto that issued a suspension of Sigh! Thank you for the resub. 13 months at tier 3. Thank you, my friend. Very much appreciated. But again, the devil of what is a suspensive veto and what is the will of the people would be just, that's what the devil is in all of this. How long would the suspension last? Would it be weeks? Would it be months? Would it be years? Would it be a number of legislative sessions? What could override it? Would it be a majority, a simple majority, a supermajority, a popular referendum, which means setting it to the people? You guys sometimes vote in the United States on, referendums at the state level to legalize or criminalize certain things. That's a popular referendum. Could the sitting session attempt to override it, or would we have to wait till the next session or the next session of the legislature, which we still haven't defined yet? It could be as easy as the crown vetoes and the following week the legislature overrides it. Or it's difficult as suffering through years of legislative turnover and then trying to achieve multiple supermajorities in succession, meaning the way this veto could have worked is like it's legislative session 1 proposes a bill, it's approved, the king vetoes. Legislative session 2, which means new elections, new elected representatives, they have to achieve a supermajority, and then the next voted group would have to achieve a supermajority. And that is complicated, and that would take years to override, a veto. And again, referencing the U.S., we have where if the president of the United States vetoes a bill or a bill, it's not a law until it becomes signed by the president or overridden. If the president vetoes a bill, it goes back to both chambers, and those chambers, the House and the Senate, must achieve a 2/3 supermajority in each chamber, and then that's the override. And that could happen the following week. right? We don't have to wait years and years and years for, the next election of each body to come in and achieve that same supermajority. One supermajority from each chamber next week is good enough. We also have what's called a pocket veto in this country, where the president can just not do anything with it, and if the Congress is not in session, that's that. It has to go back through the bill process. That's just a poorly written flaw in our Constitution. But anyway, it could be really simple, like, yep, come back next week, supermajority, done. Or we'll come back next session, new representatives, supermajority, and then their successors also must do the same thing. It's good or bad. Yeah, if I don't sign it or veto it, you can't do anything. That's exactly how the pocket veto works, and because the House and Senate would be in recess in the U.S., they can't come back and reconvene to override the veto, so it has to go back to the bill process. Mounier fought very hard against the suspensive veto, and he continued to argue for the unlimited veto. But his argument was completely undone when, of all people, the king came out in favor of the suspensive veto. So here's Mounier fighting to give the king pretty absolute power, and the king comes out and says, nah, no thanks, I'll take what Necker is selling. And it's a savvy move, right? You would sit there and go, why would the king reject being handed absolute power? The way to suggest the answer would be, why would the king refuse or not want to accept absolute tyrannical power to curry favor with other people? This is one of those moments where Louis XVI is pretty smart. He says, yeah, I'll take that suspensive veto, as long as I've got my fingers in helping you guys shape it. Super savvy move. He said that if you give me a suspensive veto that I help shape, I'll sign my name to the Declaration of August 11th and to the Declaration of Rights of Man, which is going to give those two documents ironclad legality in France. Because there's still this concept of who's really in charge here. Is the Assembly in charge? Is the King in charge? But by the King signing those documents, the Declaration of August 11th and the Declaration of Rights of Man, he would be putting all authority behind those two pieces of paper. Before the matter of the veto was settled, however, the Assembly would come together on the matter of the legislature, and they would approve a unicameral, a single-body legislature by a vote of 849 to 211. So a pretty significant majority of the National Assembly wanted the future legislature of France to look a lot like the National Assembly. And the vote is misleading, though, because you would be like, oh, why were so many people from so many divergent political perspectives all in favor of it? Well, obviously the radicals wanted it because they felt, one, it was the most democratic, and two, it was the best way to box the king in. But poor nobles were afraid of creating a bicameral legislature because they just assumed that the richer nobles would come to occupy that chamber, much like the House of Lords in the UK is a titular body. They didn't want to see the upper chamber become an appointed body that the rich and privileged would dominate. Shocker. And then the arch conservatives wanted it. And you might go, why? Not Mounier's conservatives, which were like centrist conservatives, but the really, really, really crazy guys out there on the right? The ones that are more like the Comte d'Artois going, they just took away everything. They took away everything I understood, my privileges, my titles, and everything is going to crap, and I don't understand the world anymore. So what they did is, instead of supporting what they saw as the more moderate line, which was the bicameral legislature, they said, yeah, let's get in bed with the radicals, because that thing, this assembly is crazy, and it can't control itself, and we can see that. So let's throw our support behind a body that will legislate for France that is just as crazy, unwieldy, and uncontrollable. They did it cynically. They voted for the unicameral legislature in the hope that it would fail. Spell a downfall for the Constitution and the revolution. The question of the veto is finally considered on September 12th, 1789. And the initial roll call showed no consensus. The no vote on the initial roll call, and for those of you who don't know that term, roll call means a call of the roll of present members. So anytime you see roll call vote on C-SPAN, or you see a roll call vote in any parliament or assembly or legislature that you're kind of following along with, a roll call is simply saying, are you here and how do you vote? Roll call vote for the first consideration of how do we vote had basically all three ideas on the ballot. And the crazy thing is the suspensive veto was not defined when this vote occurred. How it would work was not defined. Just that in concept, this is what we want. In concept, do we want no veto, which got 220 votes? In concept, do we want a full veto, which got 325 votes? So Mounier, the Monarchians, kind of hedge ahead of the radicals who want no vote there, or no veto there. But the suspensive veto, the concept of the suspensive veto, gets 450 votes, including the votes of Duport, Barnave, and Lamette, who were considered radicals. On the next vote, the radicals saw those numbers and said, well, some veto is better than no veto. So they threw their lot in on the concept of the suspensive veto. And it won, finally, 623 votes to 325. So by decent 2/3. In the wake of this, because Mounier didn't get what he wanted effectively, he resigns the Constitutional Committee. I didn't get my bicameral legislature. I didn't get my full and absolute veto, and he resigns it. And it's not that he was done. It was more his pride was hurt. He saw himself coming out of Dauphine with double a third and vote by head as his baby into the Estates General. He saw himself as a leader, and this was the moment where the things he wanted were no longer happening within the assembly. And so his reaction was, I'm done with this committee. Then he resigns from it. He doesn't resign the assembly yet, but he will step back from working directly in that committee of 8. So now we talk about defining that suspensive veto, because they voted for it in concept without knowing how exactly it would manifest, right? And we talked about how widely disparate it could be. It could be as simple as we override you with a supermajority next week, or it could be as bad as we got to wait 2 legislative sessions with 2 consecutive supermajorities to override your veto, and that's really long. And they didn't define any of that before they voted to approve that, yep, we want a suspensive veto. And Louis gets his hands in there, right? Because he's saying, yeah, sure, I like that. Let me help you shape that. And if you let me have my input in there, I'll sign these documents that you guys cherish so much, and we'll make those, ironclad. With Louis' input and assistance, the Monarchians grab the momentum during the definition of the suspensive veto. And they turn the defeat on no veto into a victory. And this is how it gets defined. 3 legislative sessions must pass before a crown veto can be even addressed in the unicameral legislature. There will never be a popular referendum ever to overturn a crown veto. So depending on the length of session, the interval at which you elect a new legislative body, this meant 4 to 6 years before a veto could be overturned. And in all ordinary circumstances, unless the king was completely out of touch with what was actually going on with the people, and Louis wasn't, he effectively got a permanent unilateral veto without it actually being called that. So in the wake of that definition, Mounier still resigns that committee because he didn't get the thing he wanted spelled in the language he wanted. But he gets it anyway. The Monarchians win on the veto. And this is where we get into the aftermath of this. The quick turn of this victory for the radicals, where they got a veto, into this stunning defeat just deflates them. And elections at the end of September for officers of the assembly were swept by the Monarchians. This is like president, the presiding officer of sessions, secretary, the key major offices, the positions of power within the assembly were just swept by the Monarchians. And at this point, a lot of the radicals began openly speaking of just quitting the assembly, which is crazy, right? Because we're not that far removed from the tennis court oath. We're like, 3 months from when they all swore, and then in July reaffirmed that we're here as an unbreakable, unified body working together for a constitution of France, and no matter where we have to meet, we are the National Assembly, and we will not leave, we will not dissolve until that constitution is done. We went from that to, I didn't get my way, and I'm going to quit very quickly. And it shows you how non-binding, lacking power some of that oath was. But they don't leave. And as I've stated many, many times, that the pendulum of power, while it's swinging to the Monarchians right now, is going to swing right back from them real quick. And Duport, Barnave, and Lamette are going to grab it and hold on to it for a pretty long time. The tide would turn quickly. And next week, in the next episode, we will
Remember to clonk that follow button.
we will begin to see how a simple protest by Paris housewives radically reshapes the power dynamic completely within the assembly and reshapes the future of the royal family entirely in one night. That's on a timer, Perm. So, we're going to leave the assembly in this position of the Monarchians in victory and in power. But we're going to roll into September, and it's just going to all get undercut. Not only just for the delegates of the assembly, but you have to imagine that the king feels pretty good right now too, right? That I got what I needed out of this. I just got for all intents and purposes, a uniform absolute veto. It's going to take significant legislative compromise by an increasingly divergent legislative body to override my veto. He's got to feel pretty good. But in September, he's going to stop feeling pretty good real quick because violence or the prospect of it is going to rise once again. And as stated, it's going to start off with some housewives just mad that they're hungry outside of the Hotel de Ville in Paris is going to turn into a mob of not only those housewives, but disillusioned guard members outside the gates of Versailles, which is going to force the King of France and the Legislative Assembly to stop working out of Versailles. We'll get to that next week. What I want to talk about finally tonight is the triumvirate. But we're going to take a quick break. We'll come back. We'll discuss the triumvirate, Duport, Barnave, and Lamette, and then we'll get into the quiz. Appreciate everyone who's been here. Again, Cy, thank you for the Tier 3 resub at 13 months. Mads, again, for the Tier 1. Fletch as well. Diggity, Doc, Rocket, VT for the bits. Welcome in Raph Abner as a new follower. And Fletch again for the host. I'll be right back. Get a drink. We'll talk about what the triumvirate members are, who they are, and we'll talk about what they do probably in the next couple episodes. I'll be right back. Again, stretch your legs at a minimum. Bathroom, all that stuff. I'll talk to you in a few.
Gentlemen, we're history.
welcome back. So let's talk about the triumvirate, which is going to be this group, this trio, that's going to dominate the assembly kind of until the assembly isn't the assembly anymore. They're going to be in control of levers of power. And again, this goes back to a definition from Roman times. You have to understand that in the last century BC in Rome, three individuals, Crassus, Pompey. Crassus was the richest man in Rome. Pompey was the most famous general in Rome at the time. And Julius Caesar, who became the most famous general in Rome at the time by conquering Gaul. They formed this power balance within the Senate of Rome. And that power balance became known as the triumvirate. They worked toward each other's unified interests. They pledged to always support one another. And because of their wealth, their popularity, and their military strength, in the case of Caesar, they were able to get pretty much anything done against a very ultra-conservative Senate in Rome at the time. A Senate who very much was like the arch-conservatives in the National Assembly, who wanted to preserve the old way of things. That concept would then translate into a second triumvirate involving Mark Antony and Augustus. But that idea of these three individuals working together for support, mutual support, and independent gain is going to be reflected. I wouldn't say it's exactly the same dynamic, but it'll be reflected within these three individuals. So we'll start with Adrian Duport. We know him, right? Adrian Duport was, if we go way back to when Brienne took the package from the Assembly of Notables to the Paris Parlement, there were two individuals who actively worked against him. It was Adrian Duport and Jean-Jacques Dupremenil. Duport was the liberal, right? He founds basically the Society of 30. And he worked with Dupremenil because they both wanted to have the Estates General called for their own reasons. One, Dupremenil was doing it so that the aristocracy could become ascendant in a power balance with the king. And Duport wanted it because, well, he got what he wanted. We're drafting a constitution for France as a result of the Estates General being called. But they both wanted to oppose Brienne unilaterally to get the Estates called. He was elected as a second state, a delegate from Paris. And he saw the nobility of France as the natural leadership class, not because they were nobles, but because he believed that many of the nobles merited the position, that they were better educated, they had better world experience, which probably isn't true, but he believed that the aristocracy, the nobility, was destined to lead because of superior merit. But now we're going to talk about the guy over here, Alexandre de la Mette. He is one of three brothers who fought in the American Revolution. So he was over there, same time, Lafayette was there. He and one other brother become radicals. They become very much on the left side of things, and one of his brothers doesn't, becomes very conservative. He was instrumental. So of those people who stood up on August the 4th to dismantle feudalism, he was one of the key ones. He was one of the people that was up there striking down at the privilege that defined freedom within France at the time. And then the last guy we're going to talk about, we're going to get more information on these guys as we go forward. This is just to set the foundation. Antoine Barnave. He was a lawyer in the Ancien regime. He was elected as a third estate delegate from Dauphine, so he came in with Mounier, right? He was part of that whole double the third vote by head momentum that started in the Estates Provincial in Dauphine, but then they got to the National Assembly, and this is an important point that it's going to get involved on more next week, is they diverged politically. And Barnave became more of a radical, whereas Mounier started shifting to conservative centrism, and he took a lot of people with him. But Barnave was there firsthand. Remember the Day of the Tiles when, Market Day out in Dauphine, Grenoble, and the people sounded the tocsin bells because they were going to disband the Estates Provincial out there, and all hell broke loose, and the tiles got thrown down on the troops when they fired at the people. He was there that day. And it shapes him in a way that it doesn't shape Mounier. He sees that the violence of the people, the mob action, is a vehicle. Barnave is an excellent orator. And he often spoke, as I do at times with no notes. Like, I don't outline my speeches and everything here. For those of you that are ever curious about how I do things here, I only bullet point things to trigger things into memory. But I don't write verbatim unless it needs to be quoted what needs to be in my document here. He wrote very similarly. He didn't use full notes, never wrote out full speeches. He was very much a point, trigger, speak for an extended length very well. He was an extremely gifted orator. And Mirabeau, who we profiled earlier, who was helping Lafayette write the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and who could be considered kind of a liberal because he was a member of the Society of 30. Mirabeau's going to start drifting to supporting the king. And from what we know of the Comte de Mirabeau, what do you think is his driving motivation behind starting to be a primary supporter of the king, do you think? And as that drift occurs in Mirabeau, Barnave becomes one of his great antagonists. Here is Barnave's great base contribution to where we're going. So we talked about how, as we were rolling through the royal veto and debate on the legislature, that the radicals started to recognize that they were not well organized, not as well organized as the Monarchians, and they were losing. The Britain Club, which I described as a freewheeling debate society, would conceptualize itself on the same type of foundation with an executive committee, block voting, attempts to completely dominate positions of power within the assembly. They will do those things, but they will not do them under the notion of the Breton Club. And as I said in the last section, when the housewives march on Versailles next week, in the next episode, the National Assembly and the royal family are no longer going to be located in Paris. And when in Versailles. And when they move to Paris, which is what the outcome of that will be, the Breton Club will reorganize itself into something far more famous. If you've spent any time studying French history or even read books about it, you'll know the name Jacobins. The Jacobins find their foundation in these three individuals: Duport, Barnave, and Lameth. Barnave is responsible for establishing the original rules of the Jacobins. The Jacobins would eventually drive all three of them out because they would become something else entirely under the leadership of Maximilien Robespierre and several others. But the origins of the Jacobins, who Lafayette would be a member of initially, along with many, many others, finds their footing, their basic outline of rules from the pen of Barnave. And here's the other very interesting thing about all three of these guys before we get to the quiz. They were all super young. They were all born between 1759 and 1761, making them basically 30 years old at this point in history. We don't even allow people to be elected to the U.S. Senate until they're 35. But these three guys who are about to get the hands on the wheel for one of the pretty significant periods of history during the French Revolution are all super young. And that is going to play into it a little bit. Duport and Barnave are not inexperienced, right? They're both lawyers. Duport was a magistrate, and Lameth his large background comes from being a military officer. And as they work together, we'll start to see things unfold. But the first thing that we have to get through, again, next week, what happens when a simple protest...
No way!
Yes way, next week. A simple protest at the Hotel de Ville against against continuing bread shortages, and why there were those bread shortages is the weather. We'll get into that, and then that group of women, along with some disaffected National Guardsmen who Lafayette can't control, go to Versailles and want to talk to the king. And let's put it this way: they get real close, like inside the doors. But we'll hold on that any further until next week. So that's the episode for this week, coming in at just about 2 hours, which is right what I aimed for. Longest outline I've ever written, by the way. Getting very good at condensing it down into the 2-hour format. So we will get to the quiz. For those of you that have been taking notes and paying attention, here we go. Well, thanks for all hanging out tonight. I appreciate it. let's have a look at the leaderboard. Rocket way out in front, 28. Servers at 11. Number 98 at 5. Gilly at 3. Arky, Mads, Doc at 2. Crackle, Chip, and Manshun at 1. So you're telling me there's a chance. Well, I'm still considering what to do because Rocket's so far out in front. Like, I'm not going to disqualify her or anything. But I do want to make it competitive. So I'm thinking of ways to provide prizes at the top 3, which are far more competitive with the quiz. Obviously, the first prize of pick any item from the store is going to stand probably plus something for whomever unseats Rocket or Rocket. And then I'm probably going to throw another store item in for number 2, and I don't know what I'm going to do for 3 yet, but I'm throwing around ideas. So there will be something at 2 and 3 when we get to the end of the French Revolution, which is probably even still going to be longer than I thought. Hoping next week you get to be here for the whole thing. Me too, Gilly. But no further ado, let's get to question number 1. What was the name the National Assembly took for itself on July 7th, 1789? The full name, please. The National Constituent Assembly. Rocket copy and pasted that from her notes super fast. And that's the first time she spoke because she's deathly afraid of you guys muting her. Typed it. Sweet. Make sure that goes up by 1. Alright, we're still hitched up somewhere in here, so we'll make sure that Rocket gets it again. I don't know why we're not counting it on the first one. Like, it's not clearing. I have to rebuild that this week. I should have done it during the break, but I didn't. So there we go. Rocket goes to 29. That's right. The second question tonight. Who objected to full freedom of thought in the early drafts of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and how was it later qualified in the final version? Got to put them all on the same line as one answer, please. There's 2 parts to this answer. Again, who objected to full freedom of thought in the early drafts of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and how was it later qualified in the final version? Well, so far, number 98's got the closest and half of the answer. It is Mounier, or the Monarchians. But how was it qualified in the final version? What nebulous piece of language was used? What could it not threaten? Going once. Going twice. And if we only get the answer, number 98 will get it just for having answered. Gone. It was the Monarchians who opposed... I'm sorry, not the Monarchians. No one got it right. It wasn't the Monarchians. It was the clergy. The clergy opposed full freedom of thought, and they wanted to add the addendum that it could not threaten the public order. So, no one gets the points. Remember, full freedom of thought would have been problematic if they allowed Protestants to run around for them. They would have lost control of the thought of the French population through the church. So the clergy largely opposed it. And they got, unless it, so long as it does not threaten that public order. So no one gets it. Hey, look, Rocket got one, so the next time Rocket gets a point, we're going to make sure we take care of it there. Rocket just got one. I'm not going to amend that. Actually, yeah. It's like, hey, didn't Rocket get that one? Let me fix that right now. I got to figure out what's... It's like one ahead, and I think it's because of my testing that I did with it. Let's go ahead and pull that back right now. Just hopefully that will fix things here. Let me go find Rocket. Set that back down. There we go. Should be 29. This point's 129. That'll refresh on the next time we pull it. It's not a live counter. Okay, the next question. What qualified one as an active citizen? All components in a single chat response to be considered correct, please. What qualified an individual as an active citizen in France, 1789? That is the correct answer. Must be a property owner, age 25, not classified as a servant. Hopefully that one goes up. Hey, look at that. It put her back at 29. There we go. Rocket gets another point. We'll put her back at 30. Hopefully that, again, there's a loop in there that's broken. I have to fix it. Okay. You are the problem child. The next question. When was the first motion for a preamble to the new Constitution, which would become the Declaration of the Rights of Man, introduced? The date, please. Not August 11th. Was not August 4th either. Was not August 26th either. I don't think Gilly was in here for this one. Number 98, super close. Not April 1st. July 11th. That is the right answer. And it was the day before July 12th. July 12th being the day that Necker was sacked at his dinner table, which led all the way into the Bastille. July 11th, the day before, was the date it was introduced. And therefore, I think I still just work if I do it this way. That'll probably give it to Rocket at 31. There we go. I think we're good. So Lafayette introduced the measure the day before. Basically, the impetus for all chaos broke loose in Paris. And then it was reintroduced or reconsidered on August the 4th, the afternoon before the Breton Club dismantled feudalism in France. So just bad timing both times. But the first time was the 11th of July. The next question. What total, either in number, out of number, total population or percentage of the French people qualified for active citizen status? 12%. Negative. 4 million of 30 million is correct, or 13%. Rocket gets it again. 32. This will do it. 32. There it is. That's how we're going to fix it for now. All right. Next question. For those of you who are super paying attention. Hey, I spelled a word wrong. Let's fix that now. There it is. The next question is... Rocket's locked out for 30 seconds. Here comes your question. Name the two distinct constituencies that the Comte de Mirabeau was elected as a third estate delegate from, and which one he accepted. Rocket locked out for 13 more seconds. She's back in the game now. Marseille and X, and accepted X. That is correct, Rocket. Probably a super hard question to put that one on. And even though that didn't time you out, thank you for honoring it, Rocket. I appreciate it. The timer was up there and you didn't answer. Thank you. So we are on to the next question. Name the two major sources of division between the monarchians and the radicals in drafting a constitution. Both items in a single chat response to count. And also because she acted honorably.
A resplendent offering.
Legislature and royal veto. That is also correct. Rocket dominating tonight. So it was the shape of the legislature, whether it would be bicameral or unicameral, and
Remember
the
to
veto,
clonk that follow button.
no veto, a full veto, and they landed on the suspensive veto, which ended up being like a full veto. There's your last point there, Rocket. 34 for the total. We have a couple questions left. 3 questions left, if I read this correctly, based off order. Nope, 4 questions. Alrighty. The next question. What was the key theme or idea that Lafayette was attempting to capture with the Declaration of the Rights of Man? I said this like 10 times. You guys got 30 seconds. What was the key theme or idea that Lafayette was attempting to capture with the Declaration of the Rights of Man? What concept? "15 seconds. Base idea of the revolution. Yeah, but what was it called? Not equality under law. That was one of them, Manny. But what does that? What would that fall under? What umbrella does that fall under? Principles of 1789. That is the answer. That is the philosophical answer. That is right. The Principles of 1789, which included individuals must be safeguarded against arbitrary police or judicial actions, kind of like that one, but more so that sovereign power derives from the people and that there were basic natural rights that people had. Those types of concepts, those encapsulate what the Principles of 1789 are. And the reason I boot stomped that point was because the Principles of 1789 will become a rallying cry far beyond the existence of the Constitution of 1791. Even had that bolded. Because I said it so many times. Rocket way out in front now. Okie dokie. Here comes your next question. What very vague concept enshrined in the Declaration of Rights of Man made it easy and dangerous to divorce the actual majority will of the people from the proceedings of government, and from whom does that philosophically originate? Did Sturvers fall asleep? I don't know. What very vague concept enshrined in the Declaration of the Rights of Man made it easy and dangerous to divorce the actual majority will of the people from the proceedings of government, and from whom does it philosophically originate? No. Neither one of those are correct, Gilly. The general good, but who does it philosophically originate from? All in one line, please. I'm not doing well Christmas treating this quiz. No, sir. General Good and Lafayette. Incorrect. Philosophically. From whom in the Enlightenment does it philosophically derive from? The concept of the general will. Remember, these guys are all students of the Enlightenment, so they read someone else's book to get a lot of their ideas. Give it to Rocket if no one else gets it. If someone else gets the other half, we'll give away 2 points. So general good is the concept. This whole idea of what is the majority good, majority will. It comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, philosophically. He is the romantic philosopher who comes up with the notion of the general will, the general good, this whole idea that there is a force that a movement drives to for the betterment of the people, which may not be the majority will of the people. So we'll give 1 point to Rocket there, once I put my cursor back over there and type that in there. We talked about the Enlightenment back in 1.1. It still permeates everything we talk about with respect to how these individuals think. And we'll make sure she gets it. We have 2 questions left. This one will be easy. Hopefully someone besides Rocket gets it, because she's the only one that's gotten points tonight. Here we go. At whose house did the power players in the assembly meet in order to attempt to compromise on the sources of division when drafting the Constitution? You better spell this one right. Thomas Jefferson from Mr. Landiggity. That is correct. He was the ambassador to France at the time. There it is, Mr. Landiggity knocked Manny off the leaderboard, even though he also still has 1. Last question of the night. Thank you again all for hanging out, participating in history. You are on the board! You are indeed on the board! Just fixing a spelling error, because I write these pretty quickly. The last question for episode 1.7. Oh, it was. I'll address that in a minute. Who was primarily responsible for cutting out Mounier's legs in the argument for a full and unlimited veto? Louis the 16th. Gilly gets 1. The reason I didn't give number 98 a point is because I said correct when I was incorrect about saying correct. He said Mounier opposed the freedom of thought, and I said, yeah, that's right, but that was wrong. The correct answer was clergy, so he didn't get a point because of that. But Gilly gets 1. Gilly moves into right where he was. 4th place at 4, but challenging number 98 for 3rd spot. And let's go back over here.
Let's rock!
So first of all, thank you again, everybody, for your generosity with your subscriptions tonight. One more time, that is Sai at Tier 3, Mads was Tier 1, Fletch at Tier 1, Diggity 13 months Tier 1, Doc 13 months Tier 3, and Rocket 13 months Tier 1. Thank you very much, as always, for just your support. I hope you guys continue to enjoy history, because I'm still very much enjoying writing it and coming out here every Saturday night and kind of laying down some information. 10 gift subs to the community from an anonymous gifter. Those are going to be J-Seed, Herc, Eddie gets 1. Andreas the Drummer, Vengeful Torture gets 1. Laser Scope, Darkest Shadow, Poe Dadmaran, that's a great name. J-Mitch gets 1. The Unfortunate One, 10 gift subs. Thank you very much, whomever that was. Some great names in there. Some well-deserving people. Enjoy your emotes. Speaking of, did you guys notice that one of the emotes changed at Tier 2? I think it's Tier 2 this week. So if you're Tier 2 or Tier 3 sub, you now have this one. Party on, dude emote. Well, let's go start having a look around for who we are going to go raid tonight. So there is... Okay, I'm open to suggestions. Does anybody have anybody that they feel would benefit from our company this evening? Please feel free to drop that into chat, and we'll go have a look at whom they are. I'll put the cover back up here. Mystery Science Theater 3000. Someone who's actually going to respond to us being there. I don't disapprove of the idea. Civil. We'll go see Civil. Civil's a good call. We'll go see Civil. So we'll be back next Saturday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We will pick up what is famously known as the Women's March on Versailles and look at the impact of all of that on the assembly and the royal family, and then step into the fall and hopefully the winter of 1789 and put a bow on this year if we can, As we talked about, this is about tornadoes, right? A series of tornadoes starting to emerge from that first tornado that that dominates France chaotically, but this will not be the last one. So again, thank you all for being here. I am out of here. We will get the outro rolling as we go say hi to Sybil. There's Dustin. Make sure you go give him a follow. Mornings, 7:30 a.m. Eastern Time until 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Getting back into the Far Cry series. Permanoob, not streaming next week. He's taking Permacation 2021, but he will be back the following Monday at 10 a.m. until 1 p.m. Eastern Time. He's been playing Ark, but I think his intent is to move away from that ghillie. Sundays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, maybe at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Go give that man a follow as well. Up next, I believe, is Rocket, Tuesday, Thursday afternoons, and Saturday mornings after Dustin is done Eastern Time.
Be excellent to
And
each
Omega and Sturfers are coming up, both supporting Extra Life. They put over $1,000 toward Extra Life last weekend by going through their Scoville scale exploration and stuff. Make sure you give her a follow. She'll actually be coming up on Monday night for you guys. And Omega took a week off this week, hopefully back next week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'm out of here. You guys have a great weekend. Let's go raid Civil.
Be excellent to each other.